Here are my thoughts and reflections on playing Undiscovered with a focus on discovering dusters. We have actually managed to hit 5 sessions. 5, which is pretty good, especially because we feel as though, I think collectively, very easy to say, we feel that we are really gathering a lot of momentum. I mean, we've moved quick and the momentum has built from that movement, and there's a great deal of curiosity and a great deal of drive happening. And it's not too surprising that only after about the third session, or even this fifth one, different players at slightly different points have said, "Oh, I'm starting to feel that I know who this person is," when they started quite blank. Basically, a collection of skills and a general, a couple of preliminary ideas, and the character creation process has required considerable motion, I think, in this game to really start feeling like you've got someone that you're going to go with. Well, anyway, that's going on, and that's great. It's running in tandem with my my backstory prep. I had a certain amount to start, but it was broad strokes in many ways, and I had no intention of changing any of them, and I haven't. But having seen them in action, or references to pieces of them in action, permitted me to sit down after these 5 sessions, particularly now. I mean, I've been doing so steadily, but especially right now, I'm able to say, geography, tribes, historical events, how long ago, characters, things. And I will also say there's a unspoken element of contribution here, which is my constant searching out of fantasy battle mat, desert, and rocky locations. Now, I'm not going to use all of them because that would mean that our setting would be littered with ruined shrines. But there are lots and lots, and many of them are geographically very cool. There's some where I would even say, okay, never mind the shrine in the middle. We've done a shrine. The shrine's over there. You know what it looks like. Never mind the shrine in the middle of this map. Erase that from your mind. But everything else, this terrain is what I want. This is what it's like here. So I've effectively been, laying down a location and saying, all right, we're here, and how did we get here? Fair amount of hard framing in that regard, but considering that all the characters have been able to do is to say we're going from here to there, and what they don't know what's in the middle, and why not say this one is in the middle? So anyways, I have a pretty good idea, of where the places are that are more haunted or scary, and which ones are safer, or what kind of... I'm getting a feel as I talk and play for, in this area, the flora and fauna will be like this. Spent a lot of time remembering my early teen trip to Death Valley, and thinking about the Mojave Desert in general, and looking around, thinking a lot about it, to research a bit and remember some things and stuff like that. And that's helped a lot. Okay, all that is contextual. Here's where the kind of reflections and system thoughts and play thoughts kick in. First of all, I'll start with the harder one first, the one that applies to lots and lots and lots of role-playing games. And it is the interesting effect of what happens when a roll fails, which in many games is just kind of a gray blither of dunno. Whereas here, in every single non-attack skill in Undiscovered, the authors are extremely careful. There's a paragraph in every single skill. When this skill fails, ... And it's always negative, and it's always pretty consequential for the character. And it's really, really super clear. And the interesting point then is, you could say, well, good. Now we know. We're all set with our skill rolls at last. We know what you get when you succeed, and we know what you get when you fail, and the fiction is settled. Well, not quite. If we examine this issue a little more closely, well, we'll take the example from play. The first aid skill, when applied, allows an injury to heal faster. There's a recovery rate, and then if you use a first aid roll, then the rate quickens. So that's what you get if you succeed. If you don't succeed, there's a fairly explicit paragraph about how the bone you are trying to set is set badly and therefore will not heal until it receives proper medical attention and will be actually reset, as well as similar effects for stabbing. So if you fail the first aid roll, I mean, it's not just, oh, you don't get your healing rate. No, you damage the tissue and it will now not heal even the default way. So this brings up an interesting point, which is, why roll then? Because the damage roll, you see, we have to look at other rules. The damage roll rules in this game do not include traumatized tissue effects. It's just marking down hit points. This game uses, especially since the hit points there's a lot of them and you gain more as you increase in level. It's got the D&D effect of saying, well, the hit points just simply have to be abstract. If you have 30 of them to start and you have 150 of them later, then they can't be referring actually to tissue robustness. 12 points done to the 30-point person and 12 points done to the 150-point person simply aren't the same fictional event. They can't be. And so if you use that logic, that's fine. But the interesting point is that when you have a considerable number of hit points, and we've got characters running around with, 50 and 60 right now. If you have a considerable number of hit points, and I've noticed the damage rolls really aren't all that heinous for a lot of the creatures. Some of them are, but not that. Some are like, it only does what? Well, anyway, so you go ahead and you take a hit, and let's say, as will often be the case, it ain't much, which incidentally, as a side point, actually adds a reason to think about that critical strike skill, which is a skill of its own that modifies your weapon damage. You're like, that's how you do heinous damage. You need that skill. But anyway, that aside, you have this this situation where you got a ton of hit points, you take some damage, and effectively just treat it as a soak. I mean, there's nothing in the rules that tells you that it will continue to bleed and you will lose points, or that, your bone is broken and it's going to take a long time to heal and it's going to hurt and you're not going to be able to, use that arm properly. None of that stuff is not in there. So, I've got, say, 60 hit points and I take 40 in a single hit. Let's take a really heinous, right? 40 in a single hit. And somebody says, oh, dude, don't you want to do some first aid? And you're like, what's your first aid? And they say, 45%. And you're like, no, I'll just heal at the regular rate. By definition, you have just sort of retroactively decided, by choosing not to have the first aid spell used or skill used on you, you've just decided that your wounds are minor. That's interesting. Why don't you just do that as long as you don't actually die and never use the first aid skill? It's just not worth the risk of losing your healing rate and having, special effects that do hinder your character. So it's an interesting question, and it applies to a number of role-playing games, but the two variables, the hit point situation, the abstract hit point situation, no intrinsic tissue descriptive damage rules, juxtaposed with the very specific failure state for a role like first aid. This applies throughout the game. So if you are singing and somebody says, this may not I might want to save this example for another point, but let's say you're singing and the role is very clear that if you fail the role, your song doesn't go over well and you won't get paid. Well, why not say that you're singing non-performatively just to enjoy yourself and you're not rolling, right? So there's sort of an interesting point of, well, when do you might say for singing, well, if you're singing, you got to freaking roll. You're using the skill or not. But with first aid, it's much more elective. You're using it or not because you're saying you are or you aren't. And by not using it, you're avoiding the negative effects of failing it. Especially since my next point applies. But before I get there, one last thing. What's the solution to this? I have no blanket solution. What I have is a solution for undiscovered, which is to say, in a situation, whether if you don't roll, the failure effects of rolling do apply. So in the case of that particular bite that Vefselk suffered in session 4, this hyena basically clamps down on her arm. The special effects that determined that it was hitting her arm were reasonably clear, I think. It was, non-deterministic, but it was very logical in the fiction. And so clamps down on her arm, does a maximal bite. I mean, it can do up to 30 points of damage on a bite, and I think it did something like 26. So monstrous bite, right? Crunch. And this is a hyena jaws. There's also a rule. I mean, the hyena clamps down, and it will continue to do the damage without having to re-roll, unless you can beat it in a strength contest. Which she did, actually. And Vefselk isn't actually that strong. Sam got a really good roll there and was able to miraculously, get the hell out of the hyena bite. But let's go back to that damage. That's about a third of Vefselk's hit points. And as I pointed out, could have been treated as a minor injury. And would have been until Sam said, I want to use first aid, then failed the first aid roll. And that's when I suddenly realized, wait a minute. If she hadn't made the roll and failed it, then she would have been a lot better off. That seems weird. I mean, it's sort of aversive to using the skill. So the point is, I got to thinking about this and I said, all right, from now on, whenever we're in a situation where the fictional circumstances I consider to dictate that the failure state of the skill will apply, so the only way to get out of that failure state is to succeed in the skill. If you don't do the skill, it happens that way. If you fail the skill, it happens that way.